When everything around you goes quiet, when friends drift away, plans fall apart, and the world loses its color, the first instinct is to feel rejected, to think something went wrong. But perhaps what we call a mistake, Carl Jung would call a movement of the unconscious. Isolation that comes without warning, as if the universe pulled the emergency brake on your life, might not be a punishment at all. It might be an intervention. Jung believed that the psyche, when out of alignment with the self, sends signals. And if those signals are ignored, they grow louder, until the world itself begins to echo the dissonance within. Being isolated by the universe is not always the result of failure or misfortune. Sometimes it's a sacred pause, a forced retreat from the noise designed to bring you back to something essential that has been neglected. Jung viewed this kind of withdrawal as a potential prelude to individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you truly are. In this light, isolation is not exile. It is an initiation. It is not a door closing, but rather the opening of an inner chamber, long locked and waiting. Many mistake it for loneliness, but it is something much more profound, a summons to reconnect with the self beneath the roles, identities, and masks. This type of isolation often feels uncomfortable because it asks for surrender. It pulls you away from the distractions you've used to avoid yourself. But it is precisely in that discomfort that the first seeds of transformation are planted. The universe, as a metaphor for the deeper intelligence of life, may isolate you, not to hurt you, but to prepare you, to quiet the world so that you can hear the one voice you've been taught to silence, your own. Carl Jung didn't see isolation as a mistake or a detour in the path of life. On the contrary, he understood. It is a necessary passage, often uncomfortable, sometimes painful, but ultimately essential. In his framework, individuation, the process through which a person becomes whole by integrating the unconscious with the conscious self, demands silence, solitude, and distance from the crowd. Without interruption from the external world, we are finally left alone with the unedited version of who we are. And in that space, something extraordinary happens. The self begins to rearrange itself from the inside out. We often think of change as something dramatic, visible, and immediate. But true transformation doesn't scream. It whispers. It begins not with action, but with absence, with the sudden emptiness where noise and distraction used to live. That's the paradox of isolation. It feels like nothing is happening, but everything is happening. Beneath the surface, the unconscious begins to stir. It brings with it long-forgotten symbols, unresolved emotions, dreams that have been buried under years of conformity. Without the clutter of daily expectations, we begin to see these fragments of ourselves not as problems to be fixed, but as messages to be decoded. Jung often used the image of the alchemical process to describe psychological transformation. In alchemy, base materials are broken down through intense heat and time to reveal something purer, gold. The isolated individual is placed in a kind of psychological crucible. At first, this heat burns. It feels like confusion, disorientation, loss. But slowly, the breakdown becomes breakthrough. The dissolution of the ego, the peeling away of personas and societal masks, makes space for something real to emerge. The self, not the one we perform for the world, but the one we've always been becoming in secret. Isolation also gives us the space to confront the parts of ourselves we avoid. The shadow, as Jung called it, is everything about us that we have, repressed, denied, or disowned. In daily life, it's easy to distract ourselves from it, through relationships, work, social media, noise. But in isolation, the shadow rises, and though it can be terrifying, it is also the gateway to authenticity. What we repress doesn't disappear, it waits, and when it finally surfaces in solitude, we are given the rare chance to integrate it, to reclaim our own wholeness. But this process requires patience. We live in a culture addicted to immediacy, where stillness is equated with failure and solitude with weakness. Yet Jung's psychology reminds us that growth is seasonal. There are moments meant for movement, and there are moments meant for gestation. The caterpillar doesn't rush the cocoon, it surrenders to it. The darkness, the tightness, the silence, it's all part of the becoming. In the same way, human transformation can't be forced. It must be endured, trusted, lived, and this is perhaps the most radical insight of all. To be isolated is not to be abandoned. It is to be chosen by life, by the unconscious, by the deeper intelligence of the universe. Something within you has called for change, and isolation is its response. It is not a dead end, but a sacred space, a psychological womb, a place where the soul, undisturbed by the demands of performance and approval, can finally speak its truth. The transformative function of isolation, then, is not simply about finding peace or rest. It is about being undone so that we may be built, not as better versions of who we were, but as truer expressions of who we are. And when the process completes, when the silence has said all it needed to say, we return to the world not weaker but stronger, not emptier but fuller. We come back not seeking approval, but offering presence. And this presence, authentic, grounded, whole, is the true gift that isolation was always preparing us to give. There comes a moment in many lives when the ground beneath us gives way. Everything we relied on for meaning, our relationships, ambitions, beliefs, suddenly feels hollow. We stare at the ceiling at 3 a.m. and wonder how we got here. What used to inspire us now exhausts us. What used to comfort us now suffocates. It is as if some invisible curtain has fallen between us and the world, muting the colors of life. This collapse is not always triggered by a dramatic external event. Sometimes it simply arrives, like a fog, quiet but consuming. Carl Jung referred to this existential descent as the dark night of the soul. Borrowed from the mystic tradition, the dark night is not just depression, nor is it simply sadness. It's a spiritual and psychological crucible. It's the moment when the old structures of the psyche begin to break down, not because we failed, but because they are no longer adequate to carry the weight of who we are becoming. Jung believed that the soul has its own seasons, and the ENCE, dark night is winter, barren, cold, stripped of beauty, but also necessary. It is during this time that the soul turns inward, away from performance and into presence, away from ego and into essence. The pain that surfaces here is not random. It is intelligent. It is an oracle in disguise. Beneath every tear, every tremor of despair lies a message. Pain is the psyche's way of demanding that we listen. In the darkness, we are forced to confront what we've avoided for years, the masks we wear to please others, the voices we've internalized from parents or institutions, the fears we've silenced under layers of productivity. This confrontation can feel like death, but it is death of the false self. The version of you that was molded by expectation must dissolve for the true self to emerge. Jung emphasized that such crises are not obstacles to be removed, but thresholds to be crossed. They are initiations, and like all true initiations, they involve symbolic death, a descent into the underworld of the psyche, where the ego no longer holds dominion. This is where we meet the archetypes Jung spoke of: the shadow, the inner child, the wise old man, the anima or animus. These are not abstract ideas, but living forces within us, waiting to be acknowledged. In the dark night, they step forward, not to torment us, but to guide us. And yet guidance in this stage often doesn't feel like clarity. It feels like chaos. It feels like being lost. That is part of the process. In a society that glorifies control and linear progress, this stage is misunderstood. We are told to stay positive, move on, get over it. But healing doesn't respond to commands. It responds to surrender. The dark night is not a puzzle to be solved, but a space to be entered with humility, to feel deeply, to allow the psyche to reorder itself without interference. Jung wrote, "Only the paradox comes anywhere near to comprehending the fullness of life. In the dark night, Paradox reigns. You feel both broken and awakening, empty and full, terrified, and closer to truth than ever before. Eventually something shifts, not always in fireworks, but in small, almost imperceptible ways. A breath feels easier. A sunrise feels warmer. You begin to notice symbols in your dreams. You have conversations that feel strangely meaningful. These are signs of the soul resurfacing. They are not evidence that the dark night is over, but that you are beginning to integrate its lessons. You are no longer running from the pain, but listening to it. And in doing so, you discover something remarkable. The pain was not trying to punish you. It was trying to wake you up. This is why Jung respected suffering, not as something to romanticize, but as something to understand. He saw it as part of the individuation journey, part of the necessary breakdown that precedes authentic becoming. The dark night strips you of illusions. It empties you of borrowed dreams and outdated roles. And in that rawness, you rediscover something eternal, something untouched by status or approval. You discover your soul, not the soul as an idea, but as a living reality, a presence within you that cannot be shaken, only remembered. When the night finally begins to lift, you are not the same. You move differently. You speak less to impress and more to connect. You no longer chase meaning. You embody it. The world looks familiar, but you no longer move through it as a stranger to yourself. And perhaps that was the point all along, to lose everything that wasn't truly yours so you could finally come home to what is. There are times in life when everything we try begins to fail. Relationships fall apart. Plans unravel. The energy we once had seems to disappear overnight. And the more we try to push forward, the more resistance we meet, as if life itself is pushing back. For Carl Jung, these are not coincidences. They are psychic events. When the ego clings too tightly to its narrative, when we insist on living a life that is out of sync with our deeper nature, the unconscious intervenes. It forces a withdrawal, not to punish us, but to correct the imbalance between who we are pretending to be and who we truly are. The ego, in Jungian terms, is the part of the psyche responsible for our conscious identity. It's the mask we wear, the name we answer to, the story we tell ourselves about who we are. But the ego is not the whole self. It is only the tip of the iceberg. Beneath it lies the unconscious, vast and layered, filled with everything we have forgotten, repressed, or never fully understood. When the ego becomes inflated, when it dominates our lives at the expense of the deeper self, the unconscious begins to compensate. It introduces friction, chaos, and sometimes even collapse to bring us back into alignment. This is why breakdowns can be meaningful. Why losses, though painful, often come with a strange sense of inevitability. The unconscious speaks a different language. It does not argue or negotiate, it acts. And when the ego refuses to listen, when we ignore the subtle signs, the recurring dreams, the inner fatigue, the unconscious turns up the volume. We might lose a job, end a long-term relationship, face a serious health issue. To the ego, it feels like betrayal, but to the deeper psyche, it's intervention. This forced withdrawal is not random, it's archetypal. Throughout myth and history, we see the same pattern repeat. The hero must leave the known world and descend into darkness before any real transformation can occur. Jung saw this not as a metaphor, but as a psychological truth. The unconscious will isolate us if necessary to protect the integrity of the self. It will create conditions where the ego can no longer distract itself with performance or approval, where we are forced to feel, to reflect, to descend. And yet, our culture resists this at every turn. We are taught to hustle through discomfort, to medicate pain, to label every pause as a failure. But Jung's psychology invites another interpretation. What if the pause is sacred? What if the failure is a message? The unconscious doesn't care about your resume, your productivity, or your public image. It cares about your wholeness, and sometimes the only way to restore it is to dismantle the structure the ego has built, especially if that structure was erected on fear, avoidance, or illusion. Withdrawal is the soul's protest against an inauthentic life. When we live in ways that betray our inner truth, staying in toxic relationships, following careers that drain us, conforming to roles we no longer believe in, the unconscious eventually withdraws its energy. We feel exhausted, disconnected, numb. We call it burnout or depression, but often it's the psyche saying, "I can't keep doing this." And if we continue to ignore the signs, the withdrawal becomes more dramatic. It tears down what no longer serves us, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. This tearing down creates space for something else. Listening. Without the constant distractions of ego pursuits, we are finally able to hear the whispers of the self. We begin to ask different questions. Not what do others want from me, but what do I need to become whole? This is the shift the unconscious was always guiding us toward. Not more success or stability, but more depth, more authenticity. The withdrawal was not a punishment. It was a reorientation. Eventually, if we allow the process to unfold, if we stop resisting and start listening, we find that what collapsed wasn't our life, but the false image we had been living. And beneath the rubble, something unexpected emerges. Clarity. We begin to make different choices, not out of fear, but out of resonance. We reconnect with what truly matters, and when we return from that withdrawal, we carry with us a new kind of strength, not the brittle strength of ego, but the quiet power of a self that is finally aligned. In a world that never stops speaking, silence becomes radical. We are constantly surrounded by noise, external and internal. Notifications, deadlines, opinions, comparisons, ambitions. We are conditioned to believe that being plugged in is the same as being alive. But something deep within us disagrees, something ancient. Carl Jung believed that the journey toward the true self, the self with a capital S, the totality of who we are beyond ego, requires moments of profound silence. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of interference. A stillness that allows the psyche to speak. Silence is not emptiness. It is a medium. In silence, unconscious material begins to rise. Dreams become clearer. Memories surface. Patterns reveal themselves. This is because silence does what no external stimulus can do. It creates space. Space for the self to emerge, unedited, unfiltered, unmasked. And that emergence is not always peaceful. Often, it's disorienting, because in silence, we confront the parts of ourselves we've hidden behind noise, the doubts, the grief, the longings. But Jung argued that this confrontation is precisely what makes silence essential. It is the crucible in which transformation occurs. In many spiritual and psychological traditions, silence is viewed as sacred. Jung himself was deeply influenced by mystical thought, and he saw the inner journey not as a clinical process, but as a symbolic pilgrimage. The desert, the cave, the monastery. These are not just literal places of retreat, but metaphors for the psychic space where the ego dissolves and the deeper self can be contacted. And it is no coincidence that all of these spaces are characterized by silence. They are free of distraction. They are invitations to listen inwardly. But this is where modern life rebels. We are taught to equate silence with loneliness, stillness, with stagnation. We fill every gap with stimulation, scrolling, streaming, scheduling, anything but facing ourselves. Because silence reveals truth, and truth often disrupts comfort. Yet without silence, there can be no genuine self-construction. The self is not built through performance or imitation. It is uncovered, like a sculpture beneath layers of dust. And only silence has the gentleness and the power to do that work. Jung believed that individuation, the process of becoming who we truly are, is not about addition, it's about integration. And to integrate, we must pause. We must sit with what we've run from. The silence becomes the space where fragments can find each other, where the inner child meets the adult self, where the shadow is no longer banished but acknowledged. This is the alchemy of silence. It turns scattered pieces into a whole. It doesn't offer quick answers, but it offers real ones. And in a culture obsessed with instant results, that's a revolutionary act. There is also a mystical quality to silence that Jung often hinted at. In his later works, he described encounters with the self as numinous experiences, filled with awe, reverence, and a sense of mystery. These moments rarely happen in the noise. They happen in quiet walks, in solitary reflections, in wordless tears. They arise when we are not trying to be anyone or do anything, when the ego finally rests. And in that resting, something else awakens, a sense of presence, of inner authority, of connection to something greater, whether you call it soul, self, or universe. Silence also protects us from distortion. In the absence of silence, we tend to mimic the world around us. We pick up beliefs, goals, even personalities that are not ours. We adapt to fit in, but in silence the imitation fades, and we're left with the raw material of our being. It can be messy, it can be confusing, but it's real. And once we touch that reality, we begin to build a life that reflects it, not a life of conformity, but of authenticity. Silence is not an escape from life. It is the foundation of a life worth living. Eventually, the person who has lived through silence becomes different. They move slower but with more certainty. They speak less but with more weight. They are not easily shaken because they have stood alone and survived. They know how to return to that inner refuge when the world becomes too loud again. Silence is not just a phase, it becomes a practice, a sacred rhythm, a source of clarity in the chaos. Carl Jung didn't offer formulas, he offered invitations, and silence was one of them. An invitation to stop running, to stop performing, to sit in the quiet and listen, not to the world, but to the self. In that listening, we discover not only who we are, but who we have always been beneath the noise. And that perhaps is the greatest construction of all. Sometimes life speaks in whispers, not through logic or language, but through strange patterns that seem to follow us. A phrase we hear repeatedly, a book that appears at the perfect time. A chance encounter that leaves a lasting impression. Carl Jung called this phenomenon synchronicity, a meaningful coincidence that defies statistical probability. For Jung, synchronicities are not random. They are moments where the inner world and the outer world align. They are signs, and often they appear precisely when we are being called to isolate. Isolation in this context is not about rejection. It is about alignment. The soul, the unconscious, the deeper self, whatever name we give to that part of us that seeks truth, begins to send out signals when we are out of sync. And those signals often take the form of synchronicities. The timing of them is not accidental. They tend to cluster around moments of transition, confusion, or deep inner questioning. And when we begin to notice these subtle echoes, it's as if something larger is trying to tell us, you are not where you're meant to be. Go inward. Jung saw synchronicity as one of the ways the unconscious communicates with the conscious mind. When the rational mind fails to see the signs, the unconscious orchestrates the environment to reflect back what the soul already knows. You might feel inexplicably drawn to solitude, or people who no longer resonate might start drifting away. You might stumble upon a film, a line in a poem, or a stranger's story that uncannily mirrors your own inner state. These moments are not to be dismissed. They are invitations to pause, reflect, and very often withdraw. This kind of withdrawal is not escapism. It is preparation. When the self begins to reorganize, it needs space. External obligations, social, noise, the endless scrolling of modern life. These can all become barriers to the work that needs to be done within. And so the psyche uses synchronicity to nudge us, not with fear or force, but with resonance, with moments that feel oddly familiar, deeply moving, and sometimes uncomfortably direct. We ignore these moments at our peril, because the longer we resist, the louder they become. There's a mysterious intelligence at work in synchronicity, one that does not follow linear rules. In fact, it often disrupts our plans. It dismantles routines. It introduces the unexpected. But the purpose is not chaos, it's coherence. It's about steering us away from a path that no longer nourishes our spirit and towards something that does. Often this journey begins in isolation, not because the universe wants to take things from us, but because it wants to give us back to ourselves. And we can't receive that gift if we're too distracted, too surrounded, too busy pretending. It's important to recognize that synchronicity thrives in attention. The more present we are, the more patterns we begin to see. It's not about superstition or magical thinking. It's about a shift in perception. As Jung once said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Synchronicities are the unconscious trying to become conscious. They are fate knocking on the door, asking us to pay attention, to withdraw, to listen. And in that listening, we often hear the quiet call to step away from the world, just for a while. Isolation in this way becomes sacred. It's no longer a punishment. It's a response to a higher calling, the kind of calling that doesn't shout but resonates. And when we follow that resonance, even when it leads us into the unknown, we begin to notice more synchronicities, as if the universe is confirming our steps. We meet the right person. We read the right words. We feel a peace we hadn't known before. It's not a coincidence. It's alignment. And this alignment often begins with silence, solitude, and trust. One of the most powerful things about synchronicity is that it gives meaning to the parts of our life that seemed meaningless. The breakup, the failure, the strange detour, all of it starts to make sense in retrospect. Jung often emphasized that our task is not to control life, but to listen to it, to observe its signs, to honor the symbolic layers beneath the literal ones. And when isolation arises wrapped in synchronicities, it's not a door closing, it's a path opening, a path that leads not away from life but deeper into it. So if you find yourself being pulled away, if life begins to fall quiet around you, if the same symbols or messages keep appearing, don't rush to fix it. Don't immediately fill the silence. Instead, pause, listen, ask yourself what this moment is trying to reveal. Because you may find that the loneliness is not loneliness at all. It's an initiation, a movement toward depth. And if you follow it, you may discover what Jung always pointed toward, that the most meaningful things are not found by chasing, but by allowing, not by shouting, but by listening. And the universe, strange and mysterious as it is, has always been trying to speak. After the isolation, something shifts. The transformation is not always immediate or easy to identify. It happens subtly, like the changing of seasons, until one day you look at yourself and realize you are not the same. You are not the person you were before the silence, before the withdrawal. You have faced something deep inside, and it has reshaped you, remade you in ways that are impossible to ignore. It is as if the soul has gone through a kind of alchemy. Something heavy, something dark, has been transmuted into light. In Jungian terms, this process is called individuation. It is the integration of the conscious and unconscious aspects of the psyche, a journey towards the realization of the self. Individuation is not a smooth path. It is a process of constant self-discovery, involving deep dives into our shadows and the confronting of our repressed fears and desires. It is not a destination, but a never-ending evolution of the self, each stage marked by moments of clarity and confusion, insight and chaos. When we isolate ourselves, whether by choice or by the pull of the universe, it is often the beginning of a necessary disintegration. The person we once were must undergo a death of sorts. This can be terrifying. We cling to old identities, old stories, old relationships, because they are comfortable, familiar. But in the solitude, these attachments lose their grip on us. We begin to see them for what they truly are. Not parts of us, but projections. The ego, with its need for validation and external affirmation, is forced to step aside, and in its place, something more authentic begins to emerge. In the cocoon of solitude, we shed our skin, The ego falls away, and when the time comes to emerge from that silence, we are not the same. This transformation is not simply intellectual. It is emotional, spiritual, and physical. The psyche recalibrates, and with that recalibration, our entire perception of life shifts. The chaos of the world seems less overwhelming. The noise of society feels distant. There is a quiet strength that comes from having faced one's own darkness and emerged victorious. Jung spoke of the hero's journey, a symbolic archetype that all of us must undergo in our own lives. The hero is not one who remains unchanged by their trials. They are transformed by them. The hero ventures into the unknown, faces their demons, and returns stronger, wiser, and more whole. The hero's journey is the journey of individuation, and it is marked by the return to the world, to relationships, to life itself. But this return is different because the hero no longer sees the world with the same eyes. The return is not a simple resumption of life as it was. It is the beginning of a new chapter. There is a quiet wisdom that accompanies this return. The individual who has undergone isolation no longer feels the need to prove themselves. They no longer chase validation or external success. They have come to understand that real peace lies not in the applause of others, but in the quiet knowing of one's own worth. They have learned to listen to their own voice and to trust their own instincts. They have shed the illusions of societal expectation and embraced their own authenticity. This is the mark of true strength, knowing who you are without needing anyone else to confirm it. This return, however, is not a return to the same patterns of life. It is a return to life, but with a deeper understanding. The person who has emerged from isolation is not burdened by the same fears or doubts. They no longer allow the judgments of others to control them. They walk in the world, but they are no longer of it. They have transcended the superficialities of social roles and expectations, and they carry with them a sense of inner peace that cannot be disturbed by external circumstances. In this sense, the return is also a kind of rebirth. The individual who has gone through the darkness has been remade. The experiences of isolation, of confronting the shadow, of being alone with one's deepest fears and desires, have brought them into a new phase of life. They are no longer dependent on the validation of others to feel worthy or to define themselves. The return marks the beginning of a life lived with purpose, integrity, and a deep connection to the self. Jung believed that this transformation, this individuation, is the highest goal of human life. It is not about achieving success in the external world, but about becoming the most authentic version of oneself. It is about integrating all the parts of the psyche, including the shadow, and embracing the fullness of who we are. And this process, though often painful and isolating, is what ultimately leads to a richer, more meaningful existence. The person who has undergone this journey becomes a guide for others. They do not preach from a place of superiority, but from a place of understanding. They have walked the path of suffering and emerged with wisdom, and with that wisdom, they can help others navigate their own darkness, their own isolation. This is the gift of those who have undergone transformation. They offer not solutions, but presence. They hold space for others to explore their own shadows, their own fears, and their own truth. And in doing so, they help others find their own path to individuation. In the end, the return from isolation is not just a personal transformation. It is a gift to the world. The individual who has faced their deepest fears and emerged stronger is not only more whole themselves, but they contribute to the collective healing of humanity. By returning to the world with a sense of authenticity, strength, and wisdom, they become a beacon of hope for others who are still lost in the noise, still searching for themselves. So the isolation was never an end. It all was only the beginning of something much greater, a journey towards self-realization, a journey that never truly ends but continues to unfold, with each new layer of truth revealed. And when we return as whole beings, stronger, wiser, and more deeply connected to the essence of who we truly are. In the modern world, the idea of being alone often carries a heavy stigma. Solitude is feared, avoided, and even equated with failure. Society teaches us to always be busy, always be surrounded, and always be connected. To be alone is to be cast aside, to be disconnected, to be invisible. Yet, in the eyes of Carl Jung, solitude is not an enemy to be feared, but a teacher, an essential guide on the journey to self-discovery. When we are alone, there is nowhere to hide. There are no distractions, no superficial conversations, no noise to drown out the voice inside us. In solitude, we are forced to confront our innermost thoughts, fears, and desires. We are faced with the rawness of our being, unshielded by the roles we play or the masks we wear. It is in this space that the true nature of the self can emerge. But this emergence is not always comfortable. It can be unsettling. The process of sitting with ourselves, without any external validation, can bring to the surface feelings of insecurity, loneliness, and inadequacy. However, as Jung understood, these feelings are not signs of weakness. They are opportunities for growth. In solitude, we come face to face with our shadow, the parts of ourselves that we often try to suppress or deny. These hidden aspects of the psyche may seem uncomfortable, even frightening, but they hold the key to our true transformation. The shadow is not something to be feared or repressed. It is a part of us that, when integrated, leads to greater wholeness. And solitude provides the perfect environment for this integration. Jung believed that the path to individuation, the process of becoming our true selves, requires us to confront the shadow. The shadow is made up of everything we reject or deny about ourselves. Our fears, our insecurities, our impulses. We often avoid these aspects because they make us feel vulnerable, unworthy, or ashamed. But by avoiding them, we remain fragmented. We are not whole. Solitude gives us the space to confront these dark parts of ourselves, to acknowledge them, and eventually to integrate them into our consciousness. This process is not easy, and it is rarely painless, but it is essential for our psychological and spiritual growth. Through solitude, we learn to see our own inner contradictions. We recognize that we are not simply good or bad, strong or weak, kind or cruel. We are all of these things simultaneously. And in accepting this complexity, we begin to embrace our true nature. The more we accept ourselves, our light and our dark sides, the more we become whole. This is the essence of individuation, the integration of all parts of the self. Solitude also teaches us the power of self-reliance. In a world where we are constantly seeking external approval, it is easy to forget how to trust ourselves. But in solitude, we are forced to rely on our own inner guidance. We learn to trust our instincts, our intuition, and our own capacity for wisdom. We discover that we are not dependent on others for our sense of worth or direction. In solitude, we become our own teachers, our own guides. This is a radical form of empowerment, learning to trust the voice within and to navigate life from a place of inner certainty. Moreover, solitude provides the space for reflection. In the busyness of life, we often act on autopilot. We follow routines, respond to external pressures, and make decisions without fully considering their impact. But in solitude, we are given the time to pause, to reflect, and to make conscious choices. We are able to reconnect with our values, our desires, and our true purpose. This process of reflection allows us to step out of the cycle of unconscious living and to move toward a more intentional, authentic life. Jung also believed that solitude is essential for creative expression. The creative force is born in the quiet spaces of the mind, where the ego is not trying to control or direct the flow of thoughts. In solitude, we can tap into the deepest layers of the unconscious, where new ideas, insights, and artistic visions lie dormant. These moments of inspiration often arise when we are alone, away from the distractions and pressures of the outside world. Solitude allows the creative spirit to flourish, free from judgment and expectation. It is important to note that solitude, in the Jungian sense, is not the same as loneliness. Loneliness is the feeling of being disconnected from others, of being unworthy of connection or affection. It stems from a sense of isolation that is painful and alienating. Solitude, on the other hand, is a chosen state, one that is intentional and nurturing. It is the space where we turn inward to connect with our deepest self, to listen to our inner voice, and to cultivate our own sense of peace. While loneliness is marked by a sense of lack, solitude is marked by a sense of wholeness. It is about being content in our own company, finding peace within ourselves, and learning to live with a sense of inner harmony. Jung often said that we cannot find ourselves in the noise of the world. We must withdraw into the silence of our own being in order to truly hear the voice of our soul. It is in this silence that we can begin to understand who we truly are, beyond the roles we play or the identities we have constructed. Solitude is a sacred space, one that allows us to shed the illusions of the external world and to face the truth of our own being. It is a space where we can reconnect with our innermost desires, fears, and dreams, where we can find our true purpose and direction. In this way, solitude is not a punishment. It is not a sign of failure or inadequacy. It is a gift, a teacher that guides us toward self-discovery, self-acceptance, and inner peace. It is through solitude that we can come to know ourselves more deeply, embrace our wholeness, and create lives that are authentic and meaningful. And in the end, it is only by accepting solitude that we can truly connect with others, from a place of deep understanding and love, not out of need or dependency. So, the next time you find yourself alone, do not fear it. Do not see it as an enemy to be avoided. Instead, welcome it as a teacher. Allow it to guide you, to show you the parts of yourself you have been neglecting, and to lead you toward a deeper, more authentic life. In solitude, we find the answers we have been seeking all along within ourselves.